all, and welcome to today's Antiquity. This is our last one of the semester, sadly, but we hope that you guys will join us again in the fall. Today, we are excited to be able to welcome Dr. Annie Shanley, Assistant Registrar and Provenance Researcher here at the Carlos Museum. Annie has an MA in Egyptian art and archaeology and a PhD in Egyptian art. And she has worked in the registrar's office here at the Carlos Museum for the past 7 years. And her areas of specialization include the provenance of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman antiquities, as well as Nazi-era provenance issues. Provenance research seeks to trace the ownership history of an object from the time of creation until today. As you can imagine, researching provenance is complicated. And conducting this kind of research is a time-consuming, painstaking process. So what happens when you are offered over 1,500 ancient art objects stored in an old swimming pool and have months to decide if you are going to accept or reject the gift? Today, we will learn how the Carlos Museum balanced ethical collecting practices and practical logistical concerns when accepting the Senusret Collection, the generous gift from the Ricard Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Annie.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of history about the collection. In the 1970s, French entrepreneur Georges Ricard, on the left-hand side, that's him in the jazzy white bell-bottoms. He looks fabulous. He began purchasing Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern antiquities, mostly from small French auction houses and dealers. And his goal, his passion, was to share his interest and love for the ancient world through a new museum that he was going to establish in Monaco. And on June 2nd, 1975, the Musée de l'Égypte et le Monde Antique Collection Senusret opened. And on the right, there is Mr. and Mrs. Ricard with Princess Grace and Prince Rainier. As Katie mentioned, they had over 1,500 objects in their collection. Unfortunately, the museum was short-lived. It closed in 1978 due to conditions in the building that caused conservation concerns amongst the collection. In the 1980s, the collection, along with the Ricard family, relocated from Monaco to Santa Barbara, California. That was due in part to the fact that George's son was in college at UCSB at the time. And George was developing plans to exhibit the collection at UCSB, but it was halted by state budgetary cutbacks. Ultimately, the collection was housed in the Ricard family home in Santa Barbara. And in order to continue his goal of sharing the collection, he created the Virtual Egyptian Museum, which was a website that he created in an effort to share this collection with the world. This is their former home. They no longer live there. But the Ricard home in Santa Barbara was formerly the Pool Pavilion on the estate of businessman George Owen Knapp. Before the family arrived, the pool had been covered and converted into a living space on the top and a storage space on the bottom. And if you can see, so this was the Pool Pavilion. Over here, this was actually a sort of covered swimming pool. And the swimming pool was drained. They floored over it and then roofed the area so that they could expand the living quarters of the house. But the shell of the pool still remains underneath the house. So this is their front door. If you walk down here, you will then walk down these stairs, hang a right, and then this gets you into the former swimming pool. It's actually an ingenious solution. By 2018, George had passed away. Mudslides had been ravaging Santa Barbara, and the family was moving out of the house. You know, their children were grown, they were looking to downsize. When it came to the collection, the Ricard family wanted to find a more suitable and permanent home for their collection where it could be utilized in teaching and public outreach. And so this is a little map of what they called the vault, which was the former swimming pool. So this is the entrance from the deck. And then here are some shots of the interior storage. And as I mentioned, it's actually a quite ingenious and creative storage solution. The wooden sort of slats here, the wooden shelves, actually you could unlatch them and the sides would come down. And if you see this kind of yellow color, everything was on egg crate pads because it's California and it's prone to earthquakes, which was something that was kind of funny to me as someone who's always lived on the East Coast. Earthquake-proof storage is not something we worry about. So it was an eye-opener for me to see a West Coast solution to storage. As Katie mentioned in her intro, our timetable was rather short. The Ricards were selling their house. They wanted to get out of there. And so we really had a matter of months to make a decision if we wanted this collection, and then further to make the arrangements and carry out the packing and transportation of the collection from California to Georgia. So for the question of provenance, of course, that was a main concern when we were making our decision about whether or not we should accept this collection. The Ricard family, both George and his son, after his death, kept a very robust database with detailed entries for each object. And this included provenance information and purchase details where it was known. The collection as a whole is actually incredibly well documented. Of course, it's 1,500 objects. Not every object has purchase details, and he was buying in the 1970s, which is relatively recently for antiquities. With over 1,500 objects, there's no way an army of people could conduct provenance research on every single object before the decision had to be made whether or not we would accept this collection. So what we did is we looked at the collection as a whole and looked at the circumstances in which it existed. It had been on public display in the 1970s. It had been online since 1997, which in terms of online collections is actually quite a length of time. Based on records and conversations with the Ricard family, I really did get the sense, and I still have the sense, that George collected in good faith. There are no red flag names in the purchase documents. He wasn't buying from dealers that are known to have had associations with traffickers. And most importantly, what we did is our curator, Melinda Hartwig, actually contacted the Egyptian Ministry of Culture and gave them a list of the objects under consideration and said, hey, we have been presented with this opportunity. The provenance isn't perfect. Is this okay with you? Is there anything here that you object to? And so we were able to have a really productive dialogue with the Egyptian Ministry of Culture, and we felt comfortable proceeding with the gift. So we spent a total of 2 weeks in Santa Barbara. The first week, our conservators worked to stabilize objects to prepare them for their cross-country travel. We also worked on packing the small objects into little boxes. For the second week, we had professional craters come in to crate the larger objects and to also crate in the small boxes of objects that we had previously packed. And so, one of the perks of California is you can utilize your outdoor working space. So they set up tents, and here you can see one of the guys is crating up the solar boat. This is an image of Ta Osiris's coffin as we were getting her out of the swimming pool and up the stairs, as one does with a coffin. And so it was a relatively painless process, and the objects came home to the Carlos Museum. Once they were home, that's when the really intensive work began by the registrars, the curator, conservation, and me for the provenance research. So Katie mentioned again in her intro that when we talk about provenance, we're basically talking about the life of an object. We're looking for the ownership history of an object from the time of creation until today. I want to know who owned the work, when did they own it, and how did they part with it? Did they sell it? Was it a bequest? Was it stolen from them? How did this change of ownership take place? And with all of these transactions, I want to know which collectors, dealers, agents, and auction houses played a part in the transition of ownership. And why is provenance important? Why do we care about this? Provenance may be historically significant. You may have some famous or colorful owners in an object's history. The objects themselves may have been witness to remarkable episodes in history, and that's just super fascinating to be able to fill in the life story of an object. Provenance also affects market value. In this day and age, a desirable pedigree, an extensive and verifiable provenance adds cachet and increases market value. Basically, if you can provide a solid provenance, you're ensuring that the purchaser or the acceptor of the gift that they'll have less risk that this antiquity will later be seized or subject to repatriation. Provenance can also help you verify authenticity and attribution. You can confirm in some cases artist, date, and/or subject. That occurs more often with modern art, relatively more modern art. And perhaps most importantly for us, provenance is important because it ensures good title has passed with every transfer of ownership. And so this is crucial for cultural patrimony issues such as Holocaust restoration, illegally exported antiquities, and colonial era artifacts. I also just really enjoy filling in the life story of the objects. I think it is just so interesting. It's fun. And some of our objects have lived really colorful lives. And it's just really interesting to know what their life looked like before they came here to the Carlos. And I have a picture of our Aphrodite up here. She's one of our sort of gold star objects. We can trace her back to a French collection in 1836 through publications. So she's been out of Italy or whatever her source country was for over 170 years. And so for a classical antiquity, that's amazing. So she's kind of the ideal that I hold up and want all of our antiquities to aspire to be more like Aphrodite. So how do you conduct provenance research? What do I do with myself during the day? The first thing that I do is I examine the artwork itself. I look for any labels, markings, stickers, old accession numbers. In the top left-hand corner, if you guys have been down to our Old Kingdom galleries in Egyptian, there's that adorable little relief of Heaven the dog. This is the backboard that came in with the dog. And so you have this old sticker on the right, and then on the left, that's actually a Christie's sticker. So on that backboard, that's able to give us a little bit more provenance information about Heaven. On the bottom left, that is actually a pot that was formerly in the Toledo Museum of Art, and that is their accession number on it. And so once you stare at these long enough, you're able to recognize these accession numbers, where they're written, how they're written, and what material they're written in. The super sexy part of my job is I spend a lot of time with files. I have the actual files. It's exciting. I look at the object file, accession file, conservation records, and the museum archive as well. I'm interested in any correspondence from dealers or former collectors, other museums, scholars. All of this is extremely useful information. I also spend a lot of time looking through past auction catalogs, exhibition catalogs, excavation and site reports. And now with more and more collections being put online and more provenance information being put online, not gonna lie, I spend a fair amount of time Googling, looking at other museums that have either similar types of objects to see where they came from, or similar names in their provenance to see if I can fill in some gaps within our own collection. I think one of the things that makes me a good provenance researcher is I have trust issues, and I double and triple check everything. So I should stress this is not an object from the Ricard collection, but it's a really good example of why you have to triple check everything. This is a little Egyptian wooden face, my hand for scale. The donor bought it from a gallery called Antiquus 2000. It came with a certificate of authenticity. And on that certificate, it gave the provenance as originally donated to the Dover Museum and Philosophical Institute, UK, by Mrs. Bainbridge Smith in 1894 and sold to John Heel of South Norwood in 1951, acquired from his daughter as part of a small collection. And then if you look on the back of it, it has this old, worn, slightly torn sticker written in kind of old-timey ink, right? So everything looks good. During the pandemic, I emailed the Dover Museum just to see if they knew anything about this. The registrar there was super excited to work on something new and different, so she was very helpful. Mrs. Bainbridge Smith was real. She existed, and she had given a small collection of Egyptian objects to the Dover Museum. The catch was she didn't give anything that resembled this head. She gave shopties and amulets. And so I did some further digging on the head, and it turns out it actually went through the hands of a gentleman by the name of John C. Andrews, who's a notorious art forger. He traded under many names. And not only would he forge the art, he would forge the provenance information and the provenance evidence as well. So that sticker, he aged and tore it, and so it looked good, it looked real, it looked believable. And he even went to the extent of Mrs. Bainbridge Smith was a real person. But once you start sort of peeling the wallpaper, not everything is as it seems. So I always triple check everything and then check it again. And something that I always like to stress is there are going to be gaps in provenance, and it's okay. I'm working on it. We'll get there. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Just because there's a gap, just because we don't know today where that artwork was, it doesn't mean the work was stolen or looted or shouldn't be in our care. It's one of those things we just have to accept, that it's not possible to reconstruct the entire history of every object, especially for us. We're talking about antiquities. Here's Heben making another appearance. He's 4,500 years old. That's a lot of time to deal with. Whereas the piece on the right is a 20th century African work that was purchased by the donor from the artist. So often, artwork that was created more recently, that's easier to get a full picture of its life history. For antiquities, it's much harder. We do the best we can. I'm constantly revisiting objects. There are always new databases, new sources of evidence that have come to light. It's always worth going back over. And so I say provenance research is never truly finished. And what's interesting / slightly horrifying was it wasn't until 2004 that the Association of Art Museum Directors, the AAMD, which is the main professional organization for American museums, adopted guidelines that covered the acquisition of archaeological material and ancient art. The adoption of the guidelines in 2004 were spurred in part by the looting that took place in Iraq after the fall of Baghdad in 2003. On the left-hand side at the top is some of the aftermath of the sacking of the museum in Baghdad. On the bottom is actually that same bull lyre that had been reconstructed and has now been put back on display. So they did an amazing job with this object, but they are still missing thousands of objects from the museum. On the right, this is a satellite image. Do you guys know what those little pockmarks are? Looter pits. Yeah, those are looter pits. This is Syria. And so it was really just watching the destruction that happened in the early part of the 21st century that spurred the American museums to really take notice of this and commit to an earnest good faith effort to increase our vigilance when it came to the provenance of archaeological objects. And the guidelines continue to be expanded and fine-tuned based off of world events. I always find it interesting. The Islamic State actually has created an antiquities division. They issue looting permits. So they define the little area where you can loot. You cannot loot over there. You can loot here. This is where your permit says you can loot. And then they collect a 20% tax on the proceeds of any looting. Literally turned it into a business. So the most current guidelines that American museums operate under that come from the AAMD were published in 2008, updated in 2013. These cover both purchases and gifts. So if we are to go out to an auction and purchase something, or if we were offered a gift from a private individual. The ultimate goal of these guidelines is to protect archaeological sites while allowing the ethical and legal collection of archaeological material and ancient art. And one of the things that we're trying to do is develop a mutual understanding and respect for the rights of the source countries to protect their cultural property, but also of the museums whose work it is to enhance through collecting, research, and exhibitions, the knowledge and appreciation of the artistic endeavors of the past. So we're trying to balance the needs and desires of both the museum community and also the source country. So what does this mean for the museum? What does this mean for us and new acquisitions that we are presented with? As I already said, it's really incredibly difficult to come up with a complete ownership history for antiquities. But it's not the end of the story. It's not the end of the conversation. The AAMD does allow ethically for museums to exercise their informed judgment on whether or not it's appropriate to acquire an object. And so the sort of pillars of this informed judgment as set out by the AAMD are exhibition history. When was the object displayed? How long was it displayed for? What type of institution was it displayed in? Was this a traveling show that went across the major museums of Europe, or was it in someone's house for 20 years? You know, those are two very different things. Publication history. Has this thing been published? Has this been known to the scholarly community? Has it been known to the general public? Or again, has it been sort of hidden away in someone's house without being published? We also look at provenance of other works from the same archaeological site or source country. Is this a type of object that is prone to have been looted or prone to looting? Is this a type of object that we know is favored by antiquities traffickers? Previous owners is a huge one. Are there red flag names in the provenance? Are there dealers or collectors that we know are problematic, that have associations with antiquities traffickers? And then most importantly, in my opinion, is communication with the source country. As I mentioned, we went to Egypt and asked them, we're thinking of acquiring these objects. Having that open and frank dialogue, in my opinion, is the most important part of these acquisition justifications. However, that all sounds nice and reasonable and sensible, right? But what we really, really have to pay attention to in this day and age is the cultural patrimony laws of the source countries, including export regulations for the countries. By cultural patrimony law, I'm talking about if a country has passed a law that declares national ownership over cultural heritage. So Italy, Greece are just some of the countries that have on the books laws that say any archaeological object, and they usually define exactly what that means, either that has been uncovered or has yet to be uncovered, is property of the state. They have legally vested ownership in their cultural heritage. Those laws are usually accompanied or followed by laws prohibiting or strictly regulating exports, that either these objects cannot be exported from the country, or they have to be exported by a licensed dealer, or they have to be accompanied by an export permit. By itself, the illegal exportation of an antiquity from the country of origin does not constitute a crime under US law. But once a country has legally declared national ownership over the antiquities as claiming their cultural heritage, and an antiquity has left the country after that time with no export paperwork or improper export paperwork, then it is officially stolen under US law. Does that make sense? See, nodding. Okay, good. So this is a huge thing that we have to pay attention to. It's all well and good if an object went on a grand tour of European museums in the 60s. It still doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't mean that it wasn't looted, stolen, or improperly removed from its country of origin. The other thing that I think is really important is the red flag names. If you're looking at the provenance and you're dealing with people who are known traffickers, or known to have fenced objects for traffickers, that's another thing that will cause us to walk away. So again, the publication history, the exhibition history, all of these things are great, but to me, the AAMD guidelines are more of a starting point. Let's start here in gathering the information to know whether or not we want to investigate further, to see if there's anything that sort of obviously violates the laws of the source country or raises any other red flags. So what I want to do now is just give you a few case studies from the Ricard collection that represent some of the different types of situations that I encounter when conducting provenance research on antiquities. And so we already saw Ta Osiris. She was sort of strapped in like she was on a medical stretcher as we took her up the stairs. So we got her, the mummy, her cartonnage, and then her coffin in the Ricard collection. According to the records from the family's database, Georges purchased the mummy, coffin, and cartonnage from a dealer in Paris named Francois Antonovich in the spring of 1975. Amongst the documentation provided to George was a copy of a 1914 letter from the curator of the Egyptian department at the Louvre to a Monsieur Gabriel Pétrard of Toulouse about the translation of the text on the lid of the coffin. And I was able to finally get a hold of someone at the Louvre, and they were able to verify this is a legitimate letter. This is our letterhead. This is Charles's signature, and they had related correspondence in their archive. So this is one of those fabulous cases where she came attached with a story, and we were able to verify at least part of that story. So at least we know in 1914, Ta Osiris was in France, which is, again, fabulous timing when it comes to an antiquity. Some of the other documentation that was provided from Francois Antonovich is this little note on the right. This is where we get the idea that perhaps in 1884, she was gifted to someone who was a magician, maybe a naval commander named Commander Sazanu, from Gaston Maspero, who excavated in the site of Akhmim, where we think she's from. This part of the story I have not been able to verify. So I have this note. It's tantalizing, it's plausible, but it's not something that I have been able to prove yet. And so what I like to do, because I want to get this provenance information out there, I want it to be accessible to people, I want to be transparent about what we have and what we know, is I try to word it in such a way that makes it obvious or more obvious what I have confirmed and what I haven't confirmed. So the part about Ta Osiris having been excavated by Gaston Maspero, I have said to be, because I can't prove that yet. But I don't want to leave that information out of the provenance. And same thing with Sazanu, said to be. I know she was with Gabriel in 1914, so I make that a little bit more of a declarative sentence. So as I go, you never know what could spur someone else's memory. You never know what other museum could have things from Sazanu. So I want to make sure that information is available to other researchers so that maybe we can help each other. But again, I want to make it clear what I can confirm and what I can't confirm. With Ta Osiris, one of the things that was really cool is in that 1914 letter from the Louvre, he also comments on a papyrus that was with her, a Book of the Dead. And I was able to track down her papyrus, and I was actually able to go see it in December. The papyrus lives in the Georges Foundation collection in Geneva, Switzerland. And this is the provenance that they have for the Book of the Dead papyrus, which is of course very similar to ours. The big collection or question, who knows if I'll ever be able to answer it, is why was the papyrus separated from the mummy and coffin? That seems very strange to me, unless the family held on to it for some reason. They lost it and couldn't find it until a year later. Who knows? So this is a good example too of that thing of, I know where she was in 1914. I'm not worried about her being looted, but I still want to know more. I still want to know the story of the Book of the Dead and her coffin, and see if I can fill in these gaps in her life. With the Ricard collection, the following year, the family gifted us 2 Palmyra reliefs. And we had no paperwork from the donors on these. We had no provenance information, no idea where they came from. Palmyra, as I'm sure many of you know, is an ancient site in Syria that sadly was largely destroyed during the Civil War in 2015. And it also suffered extensive looting. And there's been a huge uptick in the illegal trade of objects from Palmyra since 2015. The funerary reliefs, like this one, are very characteristic of the site. And I thought this was interesting because we talk about these reliefs, but not necessarily in context. They would have been found inside of tower tombs, like the one on the right, or in underground tombs in Palmyra's necropolis. The tower on the top right, I put that one up in particular. That's the Tower of El Abel, which was destroyed by the Islamic State in 2015. So that no longer exists. But the photo in the bottom right was taken before its destruction to give you a little bit of a sense of what these towers looked like on the inside. And it's hard to see, but actually on the ceiling is a painted fresco. It was a really beautiful and elaborate monument. So with the destruction of Syria, with the sort of precarious state that these artifacts were in, we felt it was really important to make a move on the Palmyra reliefs, even though we couldn't prove their provenance. What the donor did have were photographs of the relief and her male counterpart installed in the Museum of Monaco in the 1970s. I mean, if you look at George's pants, those could only be from the 1970s. There's no question when this photograph was taken. Also, we know that this is the interior of the Monaco Museum, which only existed for 3 years in the 70s. So while we couldn't prove where she was in the past, we knew she was not a product of the 2015 looting. And so with the Palmyra reliefs, we also felt it was important that we take these and do the research. And if it turns out they need to be repatriated, we will do that. But we didn't want them to disappear into a private collection and never be seen again. And the portrait that's in the exhibition spent time in the lab being treated by conservation intern Elena Bowen. And as part of her work, she contacted the Palmyra Portrait Project. The Palmyra Portrait Project was started in 2012. It's based at Aarhus University in Denmark. Their initial aim was simply to catalog the Palmyrene portraits across the globe in order to study the group as an expression of local identity in ancient Syria. There are about 2,500 of these portraits. So all they wanted to do was gather them and study them as a corpus. After the devastating destruction and looting at Palmyra in 2015, the Palmyra Portrait Project evolved and became a valuable resource to trace what had been lost, stolen, or destroyed. All objects from Palmyra or reporting to be from Palmyra are recorded in their database. Interestingly, the increased interest in these portraits after the destruction of the site have led to an increase in fakes that have hit the market as well. So this is another thing they're keeping an eye on. And the Palmyra Portrait Project has now come to really serve an advisory capacity to collections and dealers across the globe, including provenance researchers. And so Elena was able to email them with the information of our Palmyra portraits from the Ricard collection. And for the lady, they actually were able to find her in their database. She's number PS 652. And they were able to give us the really fabulous provenance that she was previously in the collection of architect and artist Emile Berton, who worked at Palmyra in the mid-1890s and took a number of these reliefs home with him. After his death, his collection, including our portrait, was sold at auction in Paris in 1931. And on the right here, these are pages from the archive, and there she is. She lost her nose, so she's had a little work done. I don't know when or where, but she was in California. Have your nose done. So this is really, really fabulous because we accepted this object with no provenance, and we were able to trace her back to the 1890s. And then for the Palmyra Portrait Project, they had lost track of her. They knew she was in the sale in Paris in 1931, but they didn't know what happened to her after that. So we were able to learn about our object, and we were also able to help the Palmyra Portrait Project find one of their lost reliefs as well. So that was a really great instance of the collaboration that can come about from provenance research and working with the conservation lab, since Elena did the legwork on this one. Some objects, though, are still a mystery and require ongoing research. This is one of the boats that's on display across the hall. In the donor's database, it was said to be ex-collection Henrietta Zanin, Monte Carlo from the early 1900s, and it reportedly was on loan to the British Museum in the mid-20th century, but there was no purchase documentation associated with the boat. I have no idea who Henrietta Zanin is, no clue. I spoke with a former keeper at the British Museum. There is no record of the boat ever having been on loan there. And he also told me that it's highly unlikely because in the mid-20th century, they weren't taking loans from private individuals. So I don't think the boat was ever at the British Museum. And as I said before, no idea where George got it from. This one's truly a question mark. But one of our fabulous graduate students in art history, Emily, and Caitlin, who was an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in Objects Conservation in the Conservation Lab, they conducted a really amazing study on the boat. They gave some talks about it. I'm sure at least some of you guys have seen that. And one of the things that they determined is that the sailors on the boat are not original. Many, if not all of them were added in modern times. They were able to get a CAT scan on the boat, and you can see modern drill holes where modern tools were used to put the sailors on the boat. It's entirely possible, if not probable, that the sailors were actually added by a dealer trying to make the boat more attractive to a potential buyer. And this is still in the queue of things that I need to work on and to look at, that it's possible that this sort of addition to an ancient object could be used to trace down a dealer. There are only a handful of these boats. There's at least one other that has extra sailors added to it. So it's entirely possible that just based on the wonderful study that Emily and Caitlin did and looking at the object itself, we may be able to figure out a provenance on the boat. But that is still, as I said, it's in the hopper. And then I wanted to end with this really beautiful Amarna period relief. And this is also on display across the hall. I mentioned several times that we actually communicated with Egypt before we decided to accept the collection. They gave us their blessing for everything. They did ask for this one back. They asked for the Amarna relief back, and we were more than happy to agree to that. And what I love about this and sort of this example is, in my opinion, it's a really fabulous example of this proactive approach that we are trying to take, this attitude of cooperation, collaboration, and transparency. I think a lot of museums, particularly a lot of American museums, are hesitant to have conversations with the source country because you're afraid you're going to open the floodgates. When we went and talked to the Egyptians, they did not ask for everything back. They have plenty of shopties. They don't want any more shopties. They asked for this one, completely reasonable. It's totally fine. And so one of the things that my colleagues and I are trying to encourage is more conversations between American museums, more open conversations between provenance researchers here and across the globe, and more conversations between us and the source country. We all know little bits of information, but it's only by getting together and talking about it publicly that I think everyone is gonna get somewhere with this. So that's why I like to end on this, because I think this is a great example of where we're hoping to go in the future in terms of our provenance research. So thank you all for joining me today.